So we're very excited today to have Ian Phillips at our last pig of our last ordinary pig of the school year. There are many special pigs coming up, or at least one, right? So keep your eye out for those. Ian Phillips got his PhD in 2009 from University College London, where he was a lecturer in philosophy from 2010 to 2013. And since 2013, he's been an associate professor and Gabriel Taylor Fellow at St. Anne's College in Oxford. He's won a ridiculous number of prizes. I'll mention the Association for Scientific Study of Consciousness William James Prize in 2011. He also received recently a Leverhulme Research Fellowship to write a book, which may or may not be on the experience of time, depending upon how things turn out. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Alison. Thank you all so much for coming. And so part of the reason I'm not sure I'm writing this book is just because I got so interested in this topic. So I guess I used to teach that it was just obvious that there was such a thing as unconscious perception. And I guess I'm not so sure anymore. So this is really a talk about why I'm not sure. So it doesn't have a positive conclusion. It's not meant to be a talk that says there's no such thing as unconscious perception, but it's meant to be a talk which presses some issues and says, do we really know what we think we know in this area? Okay, so here's someone who really does think that they know what's going on, G. Moore, in a defense of common sense, written in 1925, although this is a view he has throughout his life. So Moore thinks it's just obvious that perception is always conscious. And here's how he puts it. He says, the fact that I'm seeing something now is obviously related to the fact that I'm conscious now. It not only entails the fact that I'm conscious now, but it also is a fact with regard to a specific way or mode of being conscious. In the same sense in which the proposition this is red both entails the proposition this is coloured, and is also a proposition with regard to a specific way of being coloured. Okay, so for Moore, the idea that there might be unconscious perception would be a bit like the idea that there was something red but something that wasn't coloured. Okay, and arguably, and this is something that Martha Farah suggests of other people, it's not a view that she's herself defending, this is the view of common sense. She says most people would say that one has not perceived something if one is not consciously aware of that thing. Okay, so that's how things stood in 1925, and perhaps how they stand outside the seminar room. But as Jesse Prince sort of nicely captures, that's not what most people think today. Once upon a time, in the dark distant days of the early 20th century, people thought that all perception was conscious, but things have changed. Now most people think perceptual states are conscious some of the time, but not all of the time. And that, for Prince, raises a question, namely when a perceptual state's conscious. A theory of consciousness is in large part an answer to that question. So for Prince, the old view is wrong, and that brings with it the failure of the old view that perception is always conscious. This project to provide a theory of consciousness. For Prince, that theory says, in effect, that perceptual representations get to be conscious when attention is involved, and that provides the right role in potentially getting you into working memory. But those familiar with this kind of literature will be able to plug in a whole bunch of different theories of consciousness as theories of what you have to add to a perceptual state to get it to be conscious. And I think one question that's provoked by some of the things I'll say then is whether that project still looks the same, or whether there really is such a project. Okay, so one reaction you might have to this passage from Prince and to the state of things now is to think, okay, but this is really just a terminological question. Really what we've now become happy with is talking about perception in ways that Moore wouldn't have been happy with, but really there's no disagreement here. And that's not how Prince is presenting it here, presenting it as a change of view, but you might think really there's not a substantive disagreement here. So part of what got me interested in this in the first place was this passage from a recent paper of Ned Block's, where he insists that there really is a substantive issue here. So he asks, is unconscious seeing really seeing, and is this a substantial issue or merely verbal? His answer is yes, and substantial. Okay, so the thesis I'm going to focus on is what I'm going to call the same fundamental kind thesis. It's the thesis that perception of the same fundamental kind is ordinary conscious perception, that can and does occur without phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so one other thing I've mentioned in there is the idea of phenomenal consciousness, and that was also part of what got me interested in this debate, was the fact that it's Ned Block, someone who thinks that consciousness really isn't demanding of substantial cognitive capacities. It doesn't require higher order representation. It doesn't require abilities to report or respond or remember. Okay, so it's really interesting then that he too thinks that there's the possibility of perceptual states of the kind implicated in ordinary conscious perception that can occur without even phenomenal consciousness. I'll come back to that thought. Okay, so here's an overview of the talk. So firstly, and very, very briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we might mean by perception. Okay, so if our thesis is about the fundamental kind of thing that perception is and whether that can occur without consciousness, we better get clear on what perception is. Now, I'm not going to get clear about that. I'm just going to say a couple of things and then stipulate a view, which I take to be an interesting view and one held by someone, namely Tyler Burge, and in fact endorsed kind of by Block, endorsed by people who think that I'm wrong, or at least that perception so understood can indeed occur without consciousness. So it's not, it's a gift to the other side rather than a cheat, I hope. Okay, and then the main part of the talk is going to be looking at Burge's case for unconscious perception. So having accepted his understanding of what perception is provisionally, I'm going to look at the kinds of cases that he points to, suggesting that you can have that without consciousness. I won't mention perception in arthropods, but I'm very happy to talk about that if you'd like. But I will mention the human cases he points to, namely blindsight, neglect, and subliminal priming. And I'll argue in each of those cases that the case isn't clear-cut. Okay, so first, small part of the talk, what is perception? Okay, so here's an answer that's kind of popular where I used to be in London, popular in Warwick too, maybe in bits of California. Certainly a view that was popular in ways back in a different version in Moore's time. This is a view that the fundamental fact of perception is our conscious acquaintance with certain kinds of things. And as Brewer presents it in his version of this kind of relational or naive realist view, those things are mind-independent physical objects from a spatiotemporal given spatiotemporal point of view. Okay, for Moore, they were non-physical mind-independent objects. For other sense-dating theorists, they're non-physical mind-dependent objects. But the idea here that's crucial is that perception is a conscious relation to things. Now, if that's right, then there's just no question of the same kind of thing occurring outside of consciousness. You can't have unconscious conscious acquaintance. Now, one reaction to that would be, and this is something that Burge may be gesturing at in various rude footnotes in his book, something that's explicit in a paper of Bensei-Nane's from last year, that those views just are unsustainable because, after all, there is such a thing as unconscious perception, and a view that can't accommodate that fact should be rejected. Well, what to say? Well, one thing you might say, I think, is to mark a distinction between what you might think of as perceptual representation and perceptual acquaintance. Okay, so if I were a relationalist, here's one thing you could say, that cases like blindsight, cases like neglect, cases of subliminal priming, they evidence perceptual representations of a certain kind. But it turns out that those representations can be part of our information processing story about perceptual cognition without providing us with perceptual acquaintance. So what the blindsight subject lacks is perceptual acquaintance, but they have lots of perceptual representations. So I don't see anything wrong with telling that story. So I think if you're a relationalist, you should just reject the same fundamental kind thesis, and you're on perfectly okay ground. Okay, but that would be a very short talk. So here's another way of defining perception, which would also make for a very short talk. Perception is just whenever a sensory system transduces some kind of sensory input. So whenever light falls on the retina and that's converted into a neural signal, then you've got visual perception. Okay, well, if that's right, then it's pretty obvious that you can have that without consciousness. So here's a couple of cases, if they're really necessary. So there's a tract which runs from the retina to the supraplasmic nucleus, which kind of houses a master clock, or regulates the circadian rhythm. And it turns out that that can be entrained, and so the secretion of melatonin regulated, even in patients who are completely blind. And there's really no reason at all to think those patients are conscious. So that involves neurotransduction of sensory signals, of the light that's falling on their eyes, but completely outside of conscious awareness. Or at least it would be a brave view, I think, to claim that that was a conscious process. And similarly, I don't think it's plausible to think that the kind of autonomic responses to light in comatose patients, so the pupillary responses that you get in those patients, are associated with consciousness. Okay, but if this is if that's all it takes to have perception, then game over. Okay, so let's now look at an intermediary view where I think there really is an issue. So this is the view that Tyler Burge defends primarily in Origins of Objectivity in 2010. So this is a view that perception is constitutively a matter of objective sensory representation by the individual. So just to unpack that, sensory just means it begins with the registration of proprietary stimulation by a sensory system. Okay, so very crudely, in the visual case, that's just going to be light falling on the retinas of the eyes. That's actually going to be an inadequate story, but it gets very complicated very quickly in trying to spell out exactly what that would mean. Okay, so for that stimulation to get us as far as perception, it needs to achieve objective representation. Okay, so for Burge, that's a kind of representation that has as its subject matter content that goes beyond, as he puts it, the idiosyncratic, proximal or subjective features of the individual. Okay, so just the patterning of light on the retina or some other feature that's local to the perceiver, but rather content whose truth conditions turn on the presence and the possession of features by entities in the physical environment. And Burge, I mean, that's not a view that's distinctive of Burge, but one thing that's distinctive of Burge's picture, and also A.D. Smith and Susanna Siegel, is the idea that crucial to this kind of objective content, perceptual content, is the operation of the perceptual constancies. Okay, so for Burge, he thinks perception requires the operation of perceptual constancies, and as he glosses those are capacities to represent environmental attributes or environmental particulars as the same despite radically different proximal stimulations. Okay, so if you were all to run away from me into the distance, you wouldn't look to me to shrink, at least not significantly. Okay, and that's because my visual system would factor out the changing distance that you would be having with respect to me. And so you'd look to be more or less the same size. Okay, so that's an operation of size constancy mechanisms. And Burge is thinking that the operation of mechanisms like that in respect of a particular feature is what gets you objective representation of a feature of something like you out there in the world, namely your size. Okay, and you get those mechanisms with respect to all kinds of features. Okay, so far we've got objective sensory representation, and then there's a further condition Burge imposes, namely that has to be by the individual. And the idea that the representation gets attributed to the individual is actually not well spelled out, it seems to me, in Burge, and I'll come back to that at the end, but roughly the idea is that if the representation plays the right role with respect to what he calls central coordinating agency, or other times whole organism function, then the representation gets to be perception by the individual, and that's what I want to focus on. Okay, so as I mentioned, Burge gives a very familiar case for the same fundamental kind claim, so the claim that you can get objective representation by the individual without consciousness, and the considerations he appeals to are that there's a dissociation of perception and consciousness in certain arthropods. Jumping spiders are his favourite case. And then in humans, in clinical syndromes like blindsight and neglect, but also in ordinary subjects, totally without brain damage, under conditions of masking and inattention. And it's those human cases I want to talk about now. But I mean, these are cases that, just a small sample of people probably including my former self, appeals to these cases as evidence of unconscious perception. And Burge just kind of lifts this human cases discussion from Palmer's Vision Science textbook. Okay, so let's look at those cases. So here's the one I think that philosophers have got most excited about and talk most about, perhaps, namely blindsight. So blindsight is, I think, best defined or glossed as residual visual processing after destruction of primary visual cortex, or sometimes called V1 or striate cortex. Okay, so that's this bit at the back of the brain, the first cortical area that receives retinal input, and it's mapped so that the right-hand side of the visual field is processed by the left-hand side of the visual cortex and the left-hand side of the visual field by the right-hand side of the visual cortex. Okay, so if you damage or destroy, say, the right-hand side of the visual cortex, then all the processing of input to that bit of the brain is with respect to the left-hand side of the field. So you might predict a loss of visual function on that side, on the left. But in fact, it turns out that there's not a complete loss of visual function. The patients with such damage can nonetheless perform well above chance in a certain very narrow range of visual tasks. Now here's how Burge describes blindsight patients. He says that blindsight patients perceive environmental conditions on the side that they're damaged on. That perception involves perceptual constancies, including motion, location, and size constancies. The perception guides action. There is strong reason to believe that some of these patients lack phenomenal consciousness in the relevant perceptions. So then he's just going through his criteria for unconscious perception. He's first claiming that blindsight involves perception, because it involves perceptual constancies and so objective representation. And it's by the individual because that perceptual representation guides action. And then it's unconscious. Now, as many of you may well know, blindsight is immensely controversial. Okay, so it's absolutely not the case that blindsided subjects are always unconscious. Many of them have some residual awareness. Whether their behaviour should even be thought of as strictly visual is not at all obvious. Okay, so there are lots of autonomic responses that the body, I mean, the eye is the most obvious thing, but not just the eye, makes in response to this presentation of visual stimuli. And it's possible, this has been a speculation for a long time, that blindsight might involve awareness of those bodily responses and the use of those or the recruitment of those in making forced choice responses. So I'm just going to accept that that's not what's going on. And I'm also going to accept that the cases we're interested in don't involve phenomenal consciousness. But I'm happy to talk more about why I think that's questionable later. But for the present purposes, I'm granting Burge that. The issue is, does blindsight involve perceptual constancies? So what does Burge cite in support of that? Well, he cites the first edition of Larry Weiskrantz's book Blindsight, which is a good thing to cite. But in 2002, so 16 years later, Weiskrantz writes, size constancy, or in fact any of the visual constancies, has never been addressed in any of the blindsight studies of which I'm aware. And since he would have been aware of them, if anyone would have been, I take it that there is no evidence in blindsight itself concerning the presence of the visual constancies. And so here's a really speculative reason to think they might not be present in blindsight. Complete speculation on my part, but monkeys with V2 lesions, so the area immediately after V1 in the processing hierarchy, if you lesion that area, then those monkeys respond not to the objective size of objects, but to the retinal image size that they present. And the original work on that suggested that that was to do with the monkeys having problems coding distance. Now, V1, of course, provides the primary projections into V2. But it's also adapted, so Reed argues, to the specific requirements of depth perception. It performs essential pre-processing of the signals it receives from the retinae, and basically the idea is that it kind of amalgamates the input from the two retina into a single monocular input, ahead of the processing that's required to yield depth. Okay, so if that's right, obviously you need to code distance to have size constancy mechanisms in play, and essential processing for that task is destroyed if you destroy V1, then you've got a good ground for suspecting that there might not be size constancy present. Moreover, since location constancies for Burge are three-dimensional location constancies, they're also going to require representation of distance. So those two will be got rid of if you destroy V1. Okay, so there's a reason to be suspicious. That's all that is. But is there any actual experimental work here? So here's one experiment. So this is a task that Alexander and Alan Cowie did. So the subjects are getting only one of these four stimuli, and they have to say in which of the four quadrants the stimulus is located in. And the stimuli are a square wave, a Gaussian, and a Gabor. And the key difference between the top and the bottom here is just that these top ones have a sharp luminance contour, whereas these ones precisely don't. So they give this four alternative force choice task to Blindsight patients, MS and GY. And MS, at least, performs very well locating the square and the square wave, so those with sharp luminance edges. But is it chance when it comes to the Gaussian and the Gabor? So since for Burge a luminance contour is an immediate sensory effect of proximal stimulation, that kind of capacity to discriminate on that basis isn't showing objective representation. It's just showing a sensitivity to proximal stimulation. Now, so that means that there's no evidence in MS for anything other than just a sensitivity to proximal sensory stimulation. GY does much better, though. It's above chance on all the stimuli. But another experiment suggests that, nonetheless, GY's behaviour might not actually involve objective representation after all. So this is a detection task where GY is asked, say yes if you see something or if something's presented, and otherwise guess. And the two stimuli are just a circle with various colours and then a Gaussian blob with removed sharp luminance contour. Okay, but the manipulation that's important here is that the stimuli are either suddenly presented, like flashed onto the screen, and then taken away at the end of the experiment, or they're slowly onset and then just left on the screen at the end of the experiment. Okay, so you have a difference in whether there's a luminance edge and also whether they've been suddenly onset and suddenly offset or not. Now with the slow onset Gaussians, GY falls to chance on the red and green stimuli, but not the blue stimuli. But really frustratingly, no test, as far as I can tell, is done with a blue Gaussian stimuli that isn't offset and has a slow onset. So all the evidence from this paradigm is consistent with the view that GY is simply tracking sharp luminance contours or stimulus transients. Okay, so just the sudden change in the energy on the screen. Now, both of those two things are insufficient to show objective representation of events out there in the world as opposed to sudden changes in one's sensory proximal state. And that's consistent with the way the experimentalists conclude. They say that both these patients here are really only able to detect events varying in subjective salience. They're not tracking objective features out there in the environment. Okay, so there's a reason to think that experimental work doesn't tell in favour of constancy-based objective representations of blindsight. A couple of other paradigms, so Azzopardi and Hock did some work on motion detection in GY and showed that GY's capacity to detect motion is limited to the detection of first-order motion energy, so objectless motion, i.e. spatiotemporal changes in luminance, and not the way in which we normally see motion ordinarily, namely the changes in position or shape of an object. So again, I think that's totally consistent with the view that GY isn't tracking object motion as opposed to just changes in the sensory luminance pattern. Okay, and so with colour, I think this is even clearer. the controversial patient DB, who may not even have blind sight. But certainly in this case, Bob Kentridge and colleagues do work on DB showing that he matches coloured stimuli purely by wavelength. And so he's not responsive to surface colour and lacks even the rudiments of colour constancy mechanisms. Okay, so blindsight isn't a good case, I think, to testify to the same fundamental claim thesis, the claim in Burge's hands that objective representation by the individual can occur without consciousness, because you don't have grounds for thinking that there's objective representation in blindsight. Okay, so I'm now going to turn to another case, and to which I think there are also questions about objective representation, but I'm not going to press those. Instead, I want to make a different point. Okay, so this is the case of unilateral neglect. So neglect is a clinical syndrome. You often get it in stroke patients who've had damage characteristically to the right parietal lobe, and it's characterized by a failure to, well, this is a nice kind of neutral gloss, a failure to report, respond, or orient to novel or meaningful stimuli presented to the side opposite the brain lesion, where this failure can't be attributed to either an elementary sensory or motor defect. So it's to be distinguished from what you've got in blindness caused by damage to the eye or even to early visual areas like V1. Okay, so in these diagrams you can see some characteristic, possibly slightly caricatured cases of neglect behaviour. So the patient here is asked to copy this drawing of the house and copies pretty much only features on the right. So they've got damage to the right parietal and so they're neglecting features in the left hand of space. So here they've been asked to bisect this line, and you can see that they've done so with a rightward skew, as if they're not kind of tracking the left-hand side of the line. And in the bottom task, they've been asked to just cross out all the lines on the piece of paper in front of them. And you can see two things there. They've only done that for the lines on the right, and they've gone back over the ones on the right as well. So they've gone back and recrossed out things on the right as if their attention is being pulled back there. Okay, so there's a number of different kind of ways in which neglect has been appealed to as evidence of unconscious perception. One kind of study involves the behavioural, the kind of priming effects, if you like, of features that are presented on the left and then not reported. And another kind of study, which I won't talk about, but I'm happy to talk about, and are the effects of kind of perceptual effects. So imagine presenting a subject with a Muller-Lyer illusion, where they say they're not aware of anything on the left-hand side. Is their bisection behaviour changed by the presence of the fins? In fact, Muller-Lyer was symmetric, so that won't work. But the Judd illusion, where the fins go both out or both in, both out, will affect line length in an asymmetric way. And so there are studies looking at those kind of illusions and comparing them with bisection behaviour in other cases, and arguing that the fins really do have a perceptual influence, even though they're not consciously aware of those fins, so there's unconscious perception. Okay, so I'm going to talk about one study, very classic study, kind of study I used to teach using. I think it makes all the points that need making, even though the study itself is not one that you'd want to rely on for various reasons. Okay, so in this kind of pioneering study, which was from 1988, not 1998, a severe neglect patient, a woman called PS, is shown pairs of houses on cards, and these are the original cards. One of the houses obviously has flames pouring out of the left-hand side. And she's asked a series of questions. The first question is, are those houses the same or different? And she says, well, they're the same. And then she's asked, well, is anything wrong with either card? And she says, no. And then she's asked, well, which one of these houses would you prefer to live in? And she said, well, that's a silly question. In brackets, I just told you they were the same. But then when she's forced to make a response, I take it encouraged to make a response, she chose the non-burning house on 9 of the 11 trials they did. And then actually she notices the flames and it doesn't work anymore. Okay, so the interesting thought then that you get is that Whereas on the right, when flames are presented, PS immediately notices them and always prefers the non-burning house. On the left, she doesn't seem to notice them, doesn't respond as if they're there, except in this preference task where she does preferentially prefer the non-burning house. And the experimentalists, Marshall and Halligan, they write, this preference is clearly indicative of covert knowledge, but covert knowledge without conscious perceptual awareness. And they suggest this shows unconscious perception analysis far more extensive than is dreamt of in most current theories. And I mean, that's something you still find in kind of review articles and textbook presentations of this case. Now, quite how extensive the perceptual analysis is very unclear, because one difference between those two houses is just that the top one's much less symmetric than the bottom one. And so that wouldn't indicate knowledge of a semantic categorical feature like the presence of flames. But that's not what I want to think about here. I want to think about another way of explaining this pattern of data, namely a clear preference for one of these stimuli when there's a forced judgment required, which is consistent with the no and the same responses when asked that are the houses the same or different, or is there anything wrong with either house questions. Because that's going to require a little bit of signal detection theory, which I fear will be tedious for those who know it and probably too quick for those who don't, so apologies to everyone. Okay, so signal detection theory models perception as the problem of discriminating a signal, so the presence of a stimulus or some feature, from noise, which is ever present in the environment and in your perceptual system. And it models those, at least in the simple case, as two normal equivariant distributions separated by some distance, which we can measure using the parameter d prime you've probably heard of. Okay, so if d prime is 0, then those two distributions just overlap and the system has no capacity to distinguish between the presence of a signal and mere noise. And as it gets increasingly large, the system is better able to do that discrimination. Okay, but d prime alone doesn't really tell you anything about whether a given signal intensity, so say something on the bottom axis here, but that's some sensory response that's made in the presence of a stimulus, whether that sensory intensity, or signal intensity, will actually give you a positive response in the task. Okay, so if you're asked, was anything presented or did you see anything, then knowing what d prime is and knowing where the sensory response lies, that's not enough to determine whether anything's going to be said or not. Okay, so what you need is the setting of a threshold or criterion, and it's only in relation to that criterion that you can then determine what the subject is going to do. So that's in effect a threshold of signal intensity above which someone says, yes, there was something there, yes, I saw something. Okay, so in the extreme and caricatured case, if someone has a really conservative criterion, so they set it way out to the right over here, then despite being quite sensitive to the presence of a stimulus, okay, as measured by their positive value of d prime, they may just constantly say, no, didn't see anything, didn't see anything, didn't see anything. That would be surprising. Well, there may be various reasons why that would happen, but it gets interesting though when vision is poor. Okay, so imagine in this case, someone set their criterion, or the criterion is set, to avoid more than a small percentage of false alarms. Okay, so a small percentage of cases in which the subject says yes, and yet it's just noise. Okay, so that's this little tail here. I don't know how much that is, 1%, 5%. That's a perfectly reasonable way of setting your criterion. Okay, now imagine making d prime really small. Non-zero, but small, and keeping your criterion the same. And now look, what happens is that a huge chunk of the signal distribution is now below criterion. So despite perceptual sensitivity, maintaining that criterion, the one which enables you to avoid false alarms, means that you're going to say no in the presence of a signal, even despite having capacity to detect it, quite a lot of the time. Okay, so how do we determine what d prime is? I mean, how do we determine whether the subject just can't see anything, or whether they have just set a conservative criterion. Well, there's a kind of sophisticated way of doing that by plotting a so-called receiver operating characteristic curve, whose shape will tell you what D prime is. But the sort of simple way of doing it is to use a forced choice task. Okay, so here's an example of a forced choice task. You're to say in which of the two intervals, the top or the bottom, this target is presented. And it's always presented in one and only one of the intervals. Okay, so you just go bottom, top, and so on. Now, it's of course possible to be biased in a task like this, because you could have a strong preference for the top. We can factor that out. But in general, these tasks are symmetric in the sense that you just choose whichever interval has the strongest sensory response associated with it. So even if both intervals have very, very low sensory responses associated with them, responses way below the response that would give you a yes, I saw something, or yes, there was something there in a corresponding yes-no detection test, this will still elicit whether there's in fact discriminative capacity. Okay, as I say, so effectively they're bias-free, so they're kind of used to get D prime. Now, if you go back to the Marshall and Halligan study, then you can think of it as an essentially contrasting a forced choice task, right? Which interval contains the preferable house, with a yes-no task, namely, is there anything wrong with either house, yes or no, and the same different task, namely, are these houses the same or different? Now, those two tasks, the yes-no task and the same different tasks, are not symmetric. They're subject to response bias. And so it's consistent with the data to think, well, the subject is just conservative in relation to those tasks, but it turns out to have perceptual sensitivity as revealed by the forced choice task. So 3 issues that arise if that's right. Is this plausible? And is it plausible that you get conservative bias in these cases? What does it tell us if it's true about consciousness? Because I haven't mentioned consciousness yet, really, just perception. And then what about other studies of neglect? Is it really true that this generalizes? Okay, so the first thing to say is that conservative bias is just quite run-of-the-mill. So McMillan and Creelman, talking specifically about same different tasks, say that participants seem to naturally adopt strong response biases in same different experiments, in particular a preference for same as commonly observed for hard to discriminate stimuli. And in psychophysics textbooks, you're kind of warned when doing these experiments to make sure you consider bias. And in general, there's a kind of a general underconfidence phenomenon, which is somewhat disputed exactly where you find it, but you might think is a kind of pervasive feature of responding in psychophysical tasks quite generally. So, I mean, it would be interesting to do the house experiment with the graded stimuli in ordinary subjects. But you might predict that conservative bias would be present in those cases. That's a specific reason which relates to something I said earlier to think that you might find this in neglect specifically. Okay, so this is basically stealing an explanation of conservative responding in Blindsight from Paul Azzopardi and Alan Cowie's work, and applying it to the case of neglect. So if you imagine the situation a neglect subject is in before they've had any brain damage, before they've had their stroke, or in respect of their right visual field, so the visual field which we're pretending isn't affected at all by their neglect. It looks a bit like the image on the right there. Okay, so they've got widely spaced out noise signal distributions, and we might suppose a criterion which is in effect unbiased. Okay, so now we'll consider the situation after the lesion, after their stroke, say, or just with respect to their left field. Now the distributions are very close to each other, their perception is degraded, but let's say they maintain their criterion, and now they've got a really conservative criterion. Okay. So if part of what's going on in neglect is a failure to update the criterion appropriate to the right-hand side, or appropriate to pre-lesion perception on the left, to their new situation, then you predict this kind of pattern. So there's an additional reason to suspect that bias might be an issue. Okay. So I think it's very plausible that much more work needs doing. It's kind of surprisingly little work done on these subjects. In relation to signal detection theory, possibly because it's just so hard to do many trials. Let's say it's right. Let's say conservative bias is what's going on in these cases. So you've got perceptual sensitivity unreported due to conservative bias. What's that telling you about consciousness? Well, really, signal detection theory doesn't tell you anything about consciousness. It just tells you there are two thresholds you need to think about. One is a threshold at which the stimulus is discriminable or detectable. So that's the D prime is 0 threshold. So that's what you get if you get any capacity to perform above chance in a forced choice test. And then there's another threshold, which is the threshold that is variable. It's the threshold set by your criterion. So do you say yes, for example, in a yes-no test? Well, if the stimulus leads to a sensory response above your criterion, well, you might think, well, that's the threshold for consciousness. The one that's relevant to your saying yes in such a task. Okay, here's one answer then. So the one I just given, which is that stimuli are only conscious when they lie above the subjective threshold. They produce responses above the subjective threshold. And that's something you almost get in Weisskranz's work, and is kind of suggested in Leon Nakash's work too, that a commentary is a kind of sine qua non for awareness. You've got to have someone making a response in order for you to think of the event as a conscious event. Now, even Weisskranz actually reins in from saying that. He says, and it seems to be a remarkable view to have, but he thinks that a commentary, or the potential for a commentary, is what makes an episode conscious. Okay, so it's kind of got this anti-realism about consciousness that makes you just, I don't know, check your trusting the empirical interpretation there. So I mean, the data, of course, I think is perfect, but you just should think Weisskranz is not telling you things about consciousness in a completely theory-neutral way, I think, because he has a view about consciousness that most philosophers, I think, would think was very, very surprising. Okay, but let's just take the view which doesn't make the commentary what makes the episode conscious, but is a kind of the appropriate test for consciousness. Is that plausible? Well, I think there's a number of reasons to think not. Okay, so here's a passage which brings out one of them. So it's well known, say, Drane and Grunwald, that stimulus presentation conditions at which any perceiver places the boundary between judged presence and absence of a stimulus, i.e. where they place their response threshold, that can be influenced in all sorts of ways, and in particular by instructional or motivational variations. It's difficult to accept, they argue, that a subject's assertion of subjective absence of a stimulus, take it at face value, when it's known that the subject with somewhat different instructions might have indicated presence. Okay, so the point is that you can vary in all sorts of ways where a subject places their response threshold. Give them money. Give them money for avoiding false alarms. Give them money for making hits. And they would, I mean, in the simplest case, just pay them only when they make a hit, i.e. say, yes, there was something there when there was indeed a stimulus. And don't penalise them in any other case. Okay? What's the correct strategy in that case? It's just to say yes on every trial. Okay? And you might do the other things. We'll give you money when you avoid a false alarm, you make a correct rejection. And again, you just say no on every trial. Okay? But there are, of course, implicit payoffs and so-called demand characteristics, i.e. Conceptions the subject will have about what the experimentalists are looking for or what they want. Perhaps, in a blindsight subject, there may be various features of how, or a neglect subject, about how they interpret their own case. Questions about task design, experimental instructions that can vary responses in subtle ways that aren't fully understood. Of course, manipulating the prior probability of getting a stimulus will change where you place your criterion. Being in a happy mood might change it. How attentive you are might change it. Okay, so it's possible, of course, that all those manipulations also manipulate consciousness. But if you're suspicious that even one of them, doesn't manipulate consciousness but does manipulate subjective threshold, then you can't cleave to a pure subjective threshold approach to consciousness. Because there's another passage making a kind of similar point, not about the variation dependent on instructions, but about how the same observer with the same condition or absence of condition in different sessions might exhibit very different biases. Okay, so there's particularly an issue at the limits of perception for healthy observers and for clinical populations, namely that reports of subjective experience are affected by subjective bias. Some observers, or even the same observer but in different testing sessions, may not be consistent in their reports of visual events. For this reason, criterion-free, i.e. forced choice measures, provide an important objective measure of sensitivity. Okay, so that's one reason for being suspicious of a subjective threshold. Okay, here's another. A subjective threshold in effect tells you that for a perceptual state to be conscious, its content needs to be accessed. And there are at least two weaker views about the nature of consciousness to bear in mind. So one is that actually what's needed is not access, but what Bloch slightly misleadingly calls access consciousness. Namely, it's that the content of the episode needs to be poised or available for use as a premise in reasoning, or for rational control of action, or for rational control of speech. Because you might think that poised means something like available in nearby situations. Now, if nearby situations include situations with slightly different response criteria, then evidently a subjective threshold won't be a good measure for accessibility. Okay, but there's another view that Bloch, of course, wants to defend, namely that phenomenal consciousness can dissociate from access or accessibility of the content of the state to any of these cognitive systems. And if you take seriously then the idea that consciousness can occur without access or accessibility, then surely you need to take seriously the idea it can occur below the subjective threshold. And that's actually something that Bloch himself is very clear about in one paper. Both in relation to neglect, he says that we need to, well, sorry, actually, extinction, but I take it he would want to make the same point about neglect. We should take seriously the possibility that subjects really do have phenomenal experience of various stimuli without knowing it. And then in a later discussion of the exclusion paradigm, he makes clear that he thinks that subjective thresholds really only track access consciousness and not phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so if you're in any way inclined towards those views, then you should reject a subjective threshold. Okay, so here's a view which comes in and out of fashion, namely, well, we should just accept the objective threshold. It's just when you've got perceptual sensitivity, that's when you're conscious. So one objection you might have to that view was that it violated some kind of accessibility constraint you thought was plausible on consciousness. Now, I think that's a mistake, because as I kind of indicated before, if you interpret accessibility as allowing for variation in response threshold, then you can precisely think that, well, as long as D prime is non-zero, then in principle you can be motivated to lower your threshold and reveal your discriminative sensitivity in your performance. So this is the kind of point that Snodgrass and Chevron make, although they kind of fight a little bit shy of endorsing it in its full strength. They say participants can report phenomenal states that they're not, I would not ordinarily be reflectively aware of, which is something like access conscious of, namely by performing forced choice discrimination tasks, which compel participants to respond to stimuli that they would otherwise ignore, i.e. to include below criterion stimuli in reflective consciousness. So I think that there's a picture you get in that discussion, and a picture you might think that Bloch should be attracted to, which associates phenomenal consciousness with perceptual sensitivity and thinks of the subjective threshold as a kind of variable access threshold. It's not the view he goes for, but I think this is the kind of picture that we should take seriously. Okay, but another view, of course, is the view that there's just no neat mapping from either of these thresholds onto consciousness. And so when you get a situation where stimuli are falling below the subjective threshold but above the objective threshold, it's just up for grabs whether we've got consciousness or not. Okay, so I think that's all I'm going to say now about the interpretation of the signalization theory stuff. There's obviously a lot more to say, but I think if you either go for an objective threshold approach or you're skeptical of any neat mapping, then cases like the case I've just described won't tell you anything directly about consciousness and therefore unconscious perception. Okay, what about other studies of neglect? So I'm going to go very, very quickly through this, but you can ask me about it if you'd like. So there are basically, as I said, two different kinds of study that you get: priming studies and then these perceptual studies. So all the priming studies I've found of neglect involve a measurement of awareness, which is biased in some way. It's a yes-no measure, and you just get a reported percentage correct, which doesn't tell you what the underlying sensitivity is, independently of criterion. And in the one case, kind of actually the most famous case of a priming study where you can, at least if my calculations are right, calculate D prime, it turns out to be nearly 1. So there seems to be real issues in this literature with properly establishing how aware subjects are, at least in the sense of perceptually sensitive to the sort of allegedly, the primes which are allegedly outside of awareness. And those same problems appear in all the studies that use illusory or gestalt effects to show alleged perception outside of awareness, because they almost all use same different tasks to measure awareness, which are strongly or subject to strong conceptual bias. Okay, so I do think this generalizes to at least all the kind of psychophysical work in this area. So some interim conclusions. I think the neglect data is consistent with dissociations just arising from conservative bias, and you can't make inferences about consciousness then without taking a stand on the relation between subjective and objective thresholds in consciousness. So if you endorse an objective threshold or reject any neat mapping, then you can't appeal to neglect without doing more work as evidence of unconscious perception. Okay, so final bit of the talk. So if you're motivated by any of the concerns I've just been talking about, you might think, okay, well, we should look for evidence of perception where D prime is 0, okay, at the objective threshold. That's what would be a real test case for unconscious perception. And there, surely we do know there's no consciousness. So the kind of obvious paradigm in this area is mask priming. So that's and then the relevant case is what you want is an awareness task that tells you that D prime is 0 in respect of your prime, and then some task involving a consciously visible target which is in some way affected by the presence of a prime. So usually these tasks, so here's one of Marcel's kind of pioneering experiments here. They use a prime, here it's the word nurse, and when that is followed by a congruent word, here the word doctor, the classification of that as a word as opposed to a non-word is speeded and is more accurate. And that's still true even if you mask the word in certain ways, such that it's outside of awareness. Now, this is a really, really complicated literature. So lots of people say, oh yeah, Marcel showed this happened, but in fact, a couple of years later, the paradigms were rerun with the awareness thresholds properly determined, and it turned out that the paradigm doesn't work. But then more recent work, so there's a really nice experiment by Finkbeiner from a few years ago, which attempts to show semantic priming of this kind in ways which are much more rigorous. And you might think, you know, I don't want to criticize that work. That work shows a very small, about 25 millisecond facilitation effect of congruent, semantically congruent primes on a classification task. But do these effects demonstrate the same fundamental kind thesis? So they need to fulfill 3 requirements if they're going to do that. They need to implicate objective representations. They need to occur without any phenomenal consciousness of the prime or relevant feature. And they need to give us some reason that we should think of that prime as being attributable to the individual. So this was kind of nice, this came out just as I was writing this paper. There's a nice study, it's nice, it's a collaboration between a philosopher and some experimentalists, which precisely looks at the question about whether objective representations can yield priming effects despite D prime being 0. This is a paper about colour priming by Norman and colleagues from last year, and they show that there are facilitation effects with respect to color identity judgments, which are driven by a match in surface color as opposed to reflected color. So as opposed to a wavelength match, the congruency that's most effective in linear facilitation is in fact a match in surface color. So here's the paradigm. Again, I'm going to go through it very quickly, so feel free to ask more later. You get a prime in the third box along, which is this kind of bluey-green circle in the middle. And if you can see, I don't know whether you can, there's actually a kind of illumination gradient over the kind of checkerboard there. And that moves after the prime has been shown. Okay. So the prime is presented, then there's an illumination shift, and then there's this ring which is presented. Now the ring is both a mask which prevents subjects being aware of the prime. It's also the target. So it's the color of the ring which they're asked to identify as being either green or blue. And then what's interesting is that the response time is modulated depending on whether the original prime matched in surface color rather than reflected color. Okay, so that suggests that subjects that are representing an objective feature of the world, discounting the illumination, and nonetheless you get so you get priming of this kind outside of conscious awareness. Okay, so I mean, one issue that immediately arises here is, are the primes definitely unconscious? So the kind of classic view here that Kentridge endorses in another paper is that when a performance is a chance, when D prime is 0, it's extremely unlikely that a subject is having any experience of the stimuli whose presence or absence he or she cannot discriminate. Two issues here. So is D prime an adequate measure of phenomenal consciousness is one question. And the other question, a more experimental question, is, well, can we be certain that D prime is in fact 0? So just briefly, I think there are two concerns here as to whether D prime is an adequate measure of consciousness. One arises distinctively, I think, if you're like Bloch and Burge in thinking that consciousness dissociates from cognitive capacities. So if those include discriminative capacities to respond or categorize or identify, then, and D prime is indicative of something on the cognitive or discriminative side of things, then you might think that the point about phenomenal consciousness being present in the absence of access consciousness might tell against this requirement. Here's another issue. So the assumption that D prime is an exhaustive measure, i.e. Any variation in perceptual sensitivity is tracked by it. It's strictly monotonic. Schmidt argues is a really strong requirement, and one that you shouldn't take for granted. I think it is taken for granted. So he says that compare your old barometer, the needle of which tends to rise with air pressure, but it sometimes hangs. You have to knock against the shell to break the needle free. A strictly monotonic, exhaustive measure of air pressure would be an infinitely sensitive barometer, one that never hangs. Strict monotonicity is violated by conditions as trivial and inescapable as a random error in the direct measure. So, I mean, whereas you might think, well, this is kind of nitpicking, and that surely D prime is 0 is pretty good evidence, it's not an absolutely watertight connection. Okay, so I think probably a more pressing issue is whether we can be really certain that D prime is 0 in these experiments. So two broad concerns which I'm just going to gesture at, again, just to indicate a massive literature. One issue is a kind of statistical one, the null sensitivity problem. It's just the issue, mightn't these effects be due to very, very weak conscious perception? Really low values of D prime, but ones which are going to fall within the bounds of measurement error in any realistic experiment you're going to do. Okay, here's another issue, which is just that these studies are subject to huge numbers of potential artifacts. So there are very subtle differences arise between the test that you have of awareness and the priming task. So, for example, often the awareness test is done just using subliminal primes, whereas the priming task is used using a combination of both supraliminal and subliminal targets. And there's some evidence that the presence of supraliminal targets in the priming task might actually boost awareness of the subliminal or supposedly subliminal primes in that task. So then the awareness task won't be really measuring things correctly for you. So another concern which actually applies, I think, to the Norman paradigm is that you've got to be really careful that your awareness task is measuring the bit of information that's relevant to the priming effect. So the measure of awareness in the Norman task is whether subjects can detect the presence of the prime, okay, which was that greeny blue circle. Okay, but what's driving the effect is the difference between the colour of the prime. Okay, so it's whether, it's the colour of the prime, not its presence. And you might think it's at least logically possible for subjects not to be able to do very well in a test of saying whether there's a prime there or not, but actually being better than chance at a test as to whether it had one colour or had another colour. So really what you want in that study is a test where you've got some kind of test of discrimination with respect to colour. Okay, so maybe that's what Kentridge is saying. It's very implausible you'd find, and I should trust him on that. So the real issue I want to just end with is whether, even if these issues are just set aside, they're all experimental issues which experimentalists either have or will overcome, whether it indicates perception of the same fundamental kind as ordinary conscious perception, which includes being perception by the individual. So what does that mean? So Burge is very clear that perceptual systems have to be attributable to the individual, and that any perceiver has to have some perceptual states which are states that get attributed to them. And that, as he puts it metaphorically, all perceptions have to serve perception by the individual. But he does think that perceptual representations can occur which are not attributable to perceivers, but only to their brains or to other subsystems. So when are they attributable to individuals and not merely to the visual system or to the brain? Okay, here's a really quick answer which ends discussion immediately. It's when they're conscious. Okay, that's a traditional answer about what's distinctive at the personal level, so you might think, well, it's the conscious representations which get to be attributed to the individual. And I wouldn't have mentioned this because it seems so, obviously irrelevant, but actually Burge indicates himself, and not just in this passage, in other passages, that he's kind of sympathetic to a notion like this. He says he does believe there are certain notions of proprietary ownership of psychological states that hinge on consciousness. If bees are not conscious, they lack a certain type of ownership of their visual states. So that's really interesting. I don't know what he means, because he doesn't ultimately talk about it anymore. He also talks later on in the discussion of attribution to the individual about accessibility to consciousness being a part of it, but then that drops out. So the canonical view is not that view. The canonical view for Burge is that consciousness is not the basic factor in determining what's in a perceptual system is an individual's and what is merely a subsystem's. Okay, so bracket that view. Here's another traditional view. The representations that get to be attributed to an individual are the ones that are cognitively accessible. So this goes back to a very famous passage from Kant's deduction. It must be possible, says Kant, for the I think to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something would be represented in me which could not be thought at all, and that is equivalent to saying that the representation would be impossible, or at least would be nothing to me. So, inspired by that remark, you might take the view that if a representation couldn't be the object of a higher order representation, or perhaps more weakly, its content couldn't be the object of a thought, then it really shouldn't be thought of as one of your representations at all. Now, if what I said earlier was right, that representations above the objective threshold are so accessible, strictly speaking, you might think, well, it's precisely this kind of mapping of this condition of representations being attributable to the individual and d prime being over zero that kind of coming together to show you that, in fact, when you fail to have perceptual sensitivity as tracked by the d prime measure, that you've got representations that are at the individual level. And I think that that answers in ways a certain worry you might have. You might think, well, how could d prime be zero, given that clearly the stimulus is being discriminated from noise. I mean, evidently the facilitation effect on the judgments is showing you that in some sense, noise, it's not just a failure to be sensitive to the stimulus. And one answer to that is to say, look, there are two different systems here. There's the perceiver and their capacity to discriminate noise from signal. And for them, really, it is zero. But of course, there's also the visual system you need to consider, or the motor system, or the brain, and there are separate systems, and we need to think about them differently. So if you think about this kind of test as linked up with attribution, then you have an answer to that kind of worry. It's not the only answer. Okay, so what does Burge say? So Burge says, where a sensory state, non-perceptual or perceptual, can initiate action by the individual, then it's attributable. That's a sufficient condition, not a necessary one. More generally, though, it's where it's individual function and paradigmatic agency that's at the root of constitutive attributability of perception to individuals. And elsewhere he says, look, representations are attributable more or less if they're available to central coordinating agency. So with that in mind, let's look back at the one paradigm which really does, I think, show objective representation plausibly outside of conscious awareness. Is this giving you evidence of a representation that you can attribute to the individual? And I think the answer is no. So here, the response, the identification response made at the end, namely, is that annulus green or blue? That's clearly a voluntary action. Okay? That's clearly an action by the individual. But it's initiated and made in response to a consciously perceived target. Now, how should we think about the effect of the prime? Well, one way of thinking about that is that the prime is activating the perceptual system in a certain way. So it's activating certain kinds of colour processing or certain colour representations, and so that when the system encounters another stimulus to process of a similar kind, it does so more quickly or better. So facilitation there is occurring because the prime is having an effect that's activating the perceptual system in a certain way, and then the effect on action is being caused by the more rapid formation, or perhaps the more accurate, the ability to perceive better following the presentation of the target. So there the effect really doesn't give you any reason to attribute a representation to anything other than the perceptual system. Okay, so I think something similar is true of response priming. So here, the prime is this kind of arrow, and then it's again masked in a kind of meta-contrast way, and then subjects who are unable to recognize a direction of the prime and nonetheless show facilitation effects with respect to a supraliminal target. So again, this is a speculation, but you could also potentially explain this effect purely in terms of representations within a perceptual system. Okay, so I'm very nearly done, you'll be glad to know. There do seem to be some cases which are trickier to handle. But these are cases where there's no intermediary perceptual state prior to the behaviour. So there's a paper by Binstead and colleagues which suggests that subjects reaching behaviours are influenced by the sizes of targets which they cannot discriminate the size of. So they may be aware of the targets which they have to point to, but because of object substitution masking, they don't actually see the sizes, but nonetheless, the way that they trade off speed versus accuracy in relation to those targets does seem to show that they're, in some sense, or their system is in some sense representing the size of the objects. So I think this is exactly where we should be looking, but I think there are a number of worries here too. So first, I won't talk about this now, but I think interpreting exactly what's going on here is very delicate. But it can't be that any effect of perception on a response system is going to be sufficient for that representation to be available to central coordinating agency. So, Bird, for example, thinks that isochades, at least in some cases, are not actions that are imputable to the individual. But, clearly they involve certain kinds of representations of location. And and certain response systems having access to those representations. So it's a very delicate issue then whether you should necessarily have to think of this effect as anything more than a representation that's local to a response system and that gets drawn on in enacting a response, which is just, so the executive basically says, go and point, and then exactly how that pointing is achieved is something that gets modulated by representations that strictly aren't to be attributed to the individual. And then clearly there's coordination between the kinds of mechanisms involved in involuntary, non-individually imputable saccades and then the voluntary eye movements we do make. So I guess the question I really want to end with is, I don't know how we should think about the idea of availability to central coordinating agency. And so Burge's test for individual attributability sufficiently clearly enough to have a full grip on exactly what the cases would be for attributing a representation in this kind of paradigm to the individual. But let me just end with one thought, which Burge will reject, but I don't see why. So here's a natural suggestion. Availability to central coordinating agency means the possibility of exploiting that representation in pursuit of your goals as an individual. I.e., it means there has to be the possibility of agentive control. That's widely held on the basis of a whole bunch of results that subliminal influences at below the objective threshold, and in some cases below the subjective threshold, they're intrinsically or radically uncontrollable. Okay, so they do affect responding, but in ways that are contrary to the goals of the subject. Okay, so even if the prime, for example, is giving you good reason to perform in one way, its effect won't in fact be one that you can recruit to engage in that behaviour, and it will modulate your behaviour, at least initially, in the other direction. So the representations that are intrinsically and radically uncontrollable, you might think, well, they just can't be used by you as an individual. So they're at best the representations of peripheral subsystems and not yours. So there's a very natural way of spelling out agentive control, which would, I think, leave it perfectly open that there were no attributable representations of objective features outside of consciousness. Okay, so just to mention the fact that Burge will reject this condition because he thinks control clearly isn't a condition on action for him. But his only human example of that is ducking. Ducking is an action, but it's not something you have control over. But I just don't understand his distinction between eye movements and the ducking escape reflex, because it seems not at all obvious to me both are reflexes you shouldn't, in the relevant cases, not attribute to the individual. Okay, just to wrap up. So I've talked about how Burge gives us three considerations against thinking that perceptual states of individuals must be conscious. And in the case of blindsight neglect and also in subliminal priming, I've argued that those considerations aren't conclusive. So absolutely much more work needs doing, but I don't think we know how things stand as yet. So even on Burge's modern conception of perception, the Morean view, the Moore thought was so obvious, we don't think it's obvious anymore. I think it remains a viable, scientifically respectable hypothesis. Okay, thank you very much.